Hello, guys. Just wanted to go over a few things here in Chapter 1 as we're closing out the first week here, just to make sure you guys are on track with this stuff. Chapter 1 is basically just the introduction to the textbook. It's going to get into a little bit about what geography is as a discipline, the evolution of the discipline, the concepts and themes, standards, all that kind of heading its way toward this concept or idea of regions and what is going on with regions. Uh, Geography's been around for a long time. The geography that we are going to be studying in this course is coming out of the Western tradition, kind of couched in the basic uh, breadbasket of Western civilization, broadly speaking. So most of the ideas of geography that we have been developed off of ideas that originated back with the Greeks and then subsequently by the Romans after them. So this is a map of the created by the astronomer Ptolemy back about 150 or so. And so you can see geography has been around a long time. This map is actually from the Middle Ages, but does give you an idea of sort of what was going on and what people thought the world was at that time. Geography in and of itself is the study of spatial variation. That's kind of the important key. That's pretty much what we are going to be going through in a variety of different ways for the rest of the semester. We are going to be looking at spatial variation and how spatial variation actually manifests itself as we look at these different phenomena, be they physical phenomena or human phenomena. And what are those patterns that exist through space? How do things differ as we move from place to place across the globe? So again, where did this come from? Ancient Greeks and Romans. Started off a little bit with Herodotus down there as a second bullet point when he was describing the Persian Empire and the comparing and contrasting the Greek city-states or Greek civilization against the Persian Empire and Persian civilization from both an environmental aspect as well as the cultural aspect that was there. Later on, Eratosthenes, who has there's a link where you can, on the content where you can see kind of how he did it. But he made a very, very accurate calculation of the circumference of the globe. And so the Greeks were starting to figure out what was going on with the globe and applying certain mathematical processes, trigonometry in the case of Eratosthenes, to describing the surface of the Earth. Later on, we had Strabo, who came in and he was kind of describing what was going on in the Roman Empire, who the peoples were, what was the nature of the geography, and what the surrounding areas that were out there on the Roman imperial frontier. Ptolemy followed up a few centuries later as we saw that map. The big issue with Ptolemy is that he miscalculated and they actually thought that the world was smaller than it actually is. And that was operative. That was what gave Columbus the idea that he could sail west from Spain to get to China. Because he thought that about where the Americas were is where China was. And instead, what did he find? He found North America, South America, and then there was this whole Pacific Ocean between there and China. So we found out that the world was much, much larger than we had thought. And this led into the expansion of the European voyages of exploration that occurred in the latter part of the 15th century, well into the 16th and into the 17th century. As that started to settle down, we had geography move into as an academic discipline, into the European university system, also came into the American university system a little bit, but it's been much more well established on the European side. And really after about 1900, that's when we started to see this breakdown of geography into these specialized or disciplinary subdivisions. And that's going to be effectively some way that the textbook is actually organized. Each of these chapters is an specialized disciplinary subdivision within geography. So what are the dominating themes across all these subfields? Spatial variation, again, spatial systems and the linkages between those, and human environmental relationships over those spatial systems in specific locational contexts. And that is going to be regional geography. So we have that regional geography concept, and we'll start fleshing that out a little bit more. And then you have systematic geography, and that's going to be looking at landscapes and landforms, perhaps. That's one sort of systematic geography focal point. Cultural systems or languages or economic geography or other types of things. Those are all systematic approaches that get in there. So sort of the subdisciplines to some extent focus upon systematic aspects of geography. We also have the breakdown, the kind of the main breakdown in geography is between physical geography, where the focus is on the natural environment, and then human geography, where the focus is on people and what they do. It's a big discipline, again, since it's concerned with physical and cultural phenomena, human systems over the surface of the earth. But it is quite vital in understanding a lot of national and international issues. Moreover, as those issues begin to come to the forefront, and as the techniques that are covered in Chapter 2, particularly in remote sensing, satellite imagery, imagery analysis, and geographic information systems, there are an increasing host and diversity of job opportunities that are available in the field. So what are some of these concepts? Basically, recognizing spatial patterns, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at. So how can we actually take these concepts and recognize spatial patterns? And one of the main ways is we can break them down into these 6 sort of concepts that are in there, which are fairly common: space, place, location, direction, distance, size, and scale. You'll notice that place and location are listed there as separate. We'll get into why that is the case. They are different things. They are related, but they are different. So again, geography is a spatial science, and we are interested then in how things are distributed, whether those are physical systems or human systems, how movements might occur between those systems or within those systems, and how do the processes operate over the surface of the earth. Here we're getting into place now. Places have location. They have direction, they have distance with respect to other places. They'll have a size. They have effectively a physical structure, the environmental background, and then they have the cultural content. So a place is the marrying of the physical location with cultural content, and that content can be structured and explained. And it's that overlay of environment and human content that actually begins to define what is a place, and that makes a place distinct from other places. And so we have physical attributes, right? That's the climate, the terrain that's going on in there. And then we have the cultural attributes, right? That of the people who live in that area. They have particular types of food or music. What language do they speak? Or they have a particular type of religious practice that they follow. What's the economic makeup that is perhaps derivative of the physical attributes or other things that are going on in there? So we have this physical landscape, cultural landscape, overlay those, we get the place. Those attributes, though, are not fixed. They change, okay? The built environment changes, human activity patterns change, and the humans modify the environment, and the environment itself changes. This just gives you one aspect of how that can actually manifest itself in a little bit and create a regional concept. Is we have here religion and alcohol sales. So attitudes of a religious body toward the use and sale of alcohol is, in the case of Texas here, quite highly correlated, where you have areas that are dominated by Methodists and Baptists having more of a dry county system, right, where no alcohol can be sold, and areas that are more dominantly Catholic and Lutheran are areas that are more open to the sale of alcohol. Absolute location, this is the actual physical location that you have on the earth. These are the actual borders and boundaries and their mathematical representations on the globe. On the surface, that's the latitude and longitude or other grid system that's actually used to locate a point or series of points on the surface of the earth. That's the absolute location concept. Relative location concept is your position relative to other places or things. So where is Knoxville located? Well, Knoxville has an absolute location, but it also has a relative location. So the absolute location is sort of where is it, what are the boundaries of Knoxville, and then the relative location is going to be how is that actually, is Knoxville situated with respect to Nashville, Atlanta, Asheville, places like this. That becomes the relative location of Knoxville. The site is sort of the physical characteristics. That's kind of more the absolute location concept. Situation is more what's the relationships? How are you situated? You know, what's the larger sort of cultural milieu that you might be operating in? That's going to be more of your relative location. Absolute direction, those are your cardinal compass points, north, south, east, west, and all those points. in between as you work your way around the compass. Relative direction is going to be, as it says, culturally based and locationally variable. It depends on where you are and where you're from to some extent, as far as what does a relative direction mean. So what does out west mean, or back east mean, or down south? That's going to depend on where you're at, right? So if I'm in Canada, down south is the entire United States, for example. But for us here, we might be thinking Mobile or Pensacola or New Orleans or something like that. Out west for us, is that Nashville, or is that, San Francisco? And if you're in San Francisco, what's out west? Or if you're in San Francisco, what's back east? Is that Denver or Chicago or New York City, right? It's all locationally variable. And we see this as well, how we get some cultural variation on those last two terms down there, Near East and Far East. These are terms that we don't really use here in the United States too much. The Near East, where generally when we are referring to the Near East, we refer to it here in the United States as the Mid-East or the Middle East. And this Near East term and Far East term come from Great Britain or from England. So think about where England is located, and you have the Near East being those areas that are sort of in the Eastern Mediterranean, what's called the Levant. So Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, and heading into Iran. You then have the Far East. So think about England again and its location. And so what's the Far East? And here we're talking about Asia. This is China, Korea, Japan, those areas in there. So that becomes the Far East. For us, Japan and China technically are west of us, but because they are in East Asia, we oftentimes still do call it Far East. So you might see Far East more in the US context, but not so much the Near East. We'll use the term Middle East. Absolute distance, that's going to be the distance expressed in miles or kilometers or some other distance unit. The relative distance is going to be usually wrapped up in maybe a time distance. Hey, it's going to take you 15 minutes to get there, or 30 minutes to get there, something like that. Or a travel cost, is it, right? The cost of it, the movement of space through space. This was a much bigger deal back in the day when you actually had a travel cost, say, of getting on a ship to move from one location to another. And there was a definite cost to doing that. The psychological perception of distance is something that you've probably experienced. This is the notion of when you move into an area that is unfamiliar to you, or you're driving to some place that you've never been before. It can seem like it takes quite a while to actually get there. However, as you're moving back, heading back home from that location, you're moving back the same distance, but the psychological perception of the time it takes you to actually traverse that distance is less than it was when you were going forward. So it might seem like it took you 30 minutes or so to get from one place to another, but on the way back, it seems like it's only taking 10 minutes, even though the time is probably almost exactly the same. It's the psychological perception of the distance that you had to travel, because your brain is trying to pick up on clues, right? Locational breadcrumbs as you're moving into an unfamiliar place. And then as you're going back, you're picking up those breadcrumbs. And so psychologically, you're moving through that space much faster. Size, that's going to be sort of the term used by the general population, small, medium, or large. For geographers, generally you're going to be dealing with scale, and that's going to oftentimes be sort of a local, regional, or global type thing. So it's the unit studied, or it's going to be what's covered in Chapter 2, which is that relationship between the size of an area on a map and the actual size of the map surface. So think of those ratios. The map scales, the 1 inch equals 1 mile, that's a scale as well. This kind of gives you an idea of map scale and what the patterns that you see that are different. You have this one version of what the region is for the Midwestern states, and you can see the population densities that are being described for those states. However, what that does is it makes all the states appear uniformly, equal within those states. However, if you go over and you zoom in, and in this case, we're looking at Illinois, we can see on a county by county basis that the population of Illinois is not distributed evenly across the state. And in fact, it has this huge concentration of population up in the Northeast that's associated with the Chicago metropolitan region, and then a few other locations around that have some additional population that's in them. So those down in the Southwest, that's the areas east of St. Louis, Missouri, and you've got a few other counties that have some higher populations, but then a few counties that have fairly low population densities. So so as you zoom in to the scale, right, and you're looking at things at different scales, you can see different patterns emerging, and that's an important thing to take notice of. Spatial interaction, we're going to cover this in depth in Chapter 7 when we get to that in a few weeks. And it's the interrelationships between places, be that places, the physical environment, but oftentimes what we're talking about is the movement of people and goods, information between different places, and the interdependence between those areas. And that's also going to deal with accessibility and connectivity, but oftentimes very much the focal point is spatial diffusion. How are things moving through different areas? This is just one map example of how that actually deals with. You're dealing with different movements through space that are coming up and how those actually work. Globalization, we'll get into this in economic geography, a little bit in political geography as well, because it is a very political or politicized term. But it's the notion that the globe is an interconnected system or system of systems that are occurring, and that we have this increasing interaction between various peoples and populations globally as modern communications and transportation technologies have made movement of ideas and people and things much easier over time. Regions then are sort of the result of this, where we're dealing with this concept of place similarity. So we have our definition of place, we have this physical content and this cultural content and the locational aspect, and we know that no two places on Earth are exactly the same, right? But we can begin to look at the attributes of these different places, and we can determine that some places are more like each other than other places. And once we begin to identify what's similar and what's not, we begin to group things into regions, collections of areas and places that are more like each other than they are other places. So we have, like it says, we display significant elements of internal uniformity, sameness, with external differences, meaning you're different from the area outside. That begins to define your region. So we use that to break it down, the surface of the Earth and what's going on with these different processes, to make them, this complexity of what's going on, more easy to digest and understand. We've got a couple different types of regions: formal, functional, and perceptual. Here's a formal region example, the Sun Belt. Okay, here's another couple of examples. This is the nation of Belize, and the important thing here is that formal regions can cover the same territory, but they can look at different attributes. So on the left, we're looking at key biodiversity areas, okay, but one of the things that's related to that is also then going to be protected areas. So how much of those biodiversity areas are being defined as protected areas, and what are the different levels of protection? So you have a formal region of classifying things in the terms of biodiversity, and then you have another way of formalizing it, which is through some sort of designated administrative boundary or designation. This is a functional region where you've got you're showing some interrelationships that exist between banking centers and their branch banks, sort of who's tied into who. This is also going to be a fairly common way of defining certain economic relationships that exist between different locations. This is another way of looking at that as well. This is some commuting patterns for some of the major metropolitan areas. What's sort of the commuter shed of how people are moving through space to get to work on a day-to-day basis. And you can see sort of this variation that exists as a result of where people are moving. So again, what are some of the main economic relationships that are going to exist between those different places? We then have the vernacular or perceptual regions that come about. This is taken from a study that was done back in the 60s that were in there. And you can see these are sort of popular perceptions of when you say, what's the South? And you get this determination. What's the Midwest? What's the West? And as you sample and survey people, you get these different ideas, and you're able to sort of coalesce them into this popular imagination of what these different regions entail, who's part of that area. Again, we have some different themes that are out in there, and these are all put together by a variety of different organizations. You got the Association of American Geographers, the National Council for Geographic Education, And they've basically said what we should be concentrating on geographic education and inquiry are location and place, the differences between those, the relationships or the spatial interactions that are going to exist, movement, again, part of that, and then how does that all relate into regions. The National Geographic Standards were also put together back in 1994, and basically the notion is that you have geographic techniques and skills, Chapter 2 of the text, the notion of physical systems, human systems, the interaction between those, that's the environment and society interactions, how can geography actually be used, and then again, the determination of places and subsequent regions. And that basically covers the basic topics of Chapter 1, and from there, we'll move on to Chapter 2 later on, and hope you guys are having a good time. And that is going to be it for Chapter 1.